Hello and welcome to a new special series that we are doing with DUTCH Test. We're going to be talking about the cortisol awakening response. I'm super excited to share. In this session, you're going to learn about the cortisol awakening response and sort of how it became the default test for stress and how you can take advantage of this information in your practice. And so check out this segment. I think you'll really like it. So a warm welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Carrie Jones. Welcome, Doc.
Thanks, James. Appreciate being back here.
Great to have you back here on the podcast, and I'm excited for this series that we're going to do, really getting into stress, and we'll be doing a whole series on stress in the brain. So the first, this is going to be a series of 3, and I guess the question that we really wanted to ask today was just about the cortisol awakening response, which has kind of become the default tool in a certain way for assessing stress. So how did we get here? And can you sort of, for our audience, give us sort of a baseline of why that test became the tool for doing that?
Yeah, I'd have to say it's like quickly becoming my new favorite topic to talk about, the cortisol awakening response, just because it gives so much insight into stress response, stress resiliency. I'm sure, as you know, the number of people out there who just don't have a lot of really good resiliency. They'll tell you, I don't feel resilient. I wake up in the morning, I can't get going. Or the opposite, they're like hyper resilient. They're hyper vigilant. They're anxious. They go from 0 to 10. Their heart races, and they can't figure out what's going on. And that's all centered around that cortisol awakening response. So that is for sure what I want to talk about. But before we do, let's back up a step. Let's talk about the basics, just to remind people that it all comes out of the HPA axis. It comes out of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And so any kind of stress response, stress signal, from anywhere in the body, anywhere outside the body, comes up to the brain, to the hypothalamus, and then that triggers the release of CRH, goes down to the anterior pituitary, that triggers ACTH, which then triggers cortisol release. And then within the stress response, you get your norepinephrine, which is noradrenaline, and your epinephrine, which is adrenaline release at the same time. And because people want to test this, right? They want to know, well, how stressed out am I? I'm tired, or I'm not tired, or, I'm anxious. Where do I really look? And so that's what really drove people to doing saliva testing. And they would do saliva testing because they could get that saliva test first thing in the morning on waking, and then they could collect again, maybe later in the morning, or maybe at lunch, and then they would collect again in the afternoon, and then they would collect again at nighttime, and they'd get this nice, pretty 4-point curve through the day to see if they go up, down like they're supposed to, or if they're more flatlined, or if they, shoot through the moon. So that then led us to the cortisol awakening response, and it became this super big deal. Why do we care about the cortisol awakening response? And we've already got this pretty 4-point picture, and it tells you what's going on. But the cool thing about the cortisol awakening response, there's this great quote that I read that says the cortisol awakening response, or the CAR, occurs upon awakening in the absence of any apparent stressful situation or imminent danger. So it's this spike in cortisol, whether you want it or not. It's the body is doing it for a number of reasons. And it's supposed to go up, and then it's supposed to come down. And like I've been saying, some people don't. They just don't have the stress response. They don't have the stress resilience, or they're hyper vigilant. They're too much. And so they within that first part of their day, it's just not healthy. And they don't feel healthy. They tell you that. They tell you, I wake up and feel terrible, or I wake up and I feel anxious, or I wake up and I feel depressed, or I wake up and I hurt, my joints hurt. What's going on here? And the thing about the CAR is it's influenced by so many things. It's influenced by our health status, our behaviors, our stress perception. If we think it's going to be a really stressful day, if we're anticipating a lot at work, or we wake up and we check our text messages and immediately it's, just awful things coming at us. Which is maybe why we constantly tell people, don't check your phone first thing on waking, because it just sets off the cortisol awakening response. So now that we've kind of moved forward, we know how cortisol is made. We know how cortisol was tested. How does the actual cortisol awakening response work? And so it's this process where the body knows you're about to wake up. The body's like, okay, he or she's getting closer. And so the pituitary is releasing ACTH in a pulsatile manner. But the adrenal glands are like, no, not yet. No, not yet. And it puts this blunting on. And until the person opens their eyes in the morning and light enters in to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, the SCN, in the brain, and then goes into the brain, then the blunting releases. You get what's called this flip-flop in the brain, and cortisol shoots up. And it's supposed to shoot up about 50% over baseline, at least in the first 30 minutes. So you've got about 30 minutes that your cortisol is going to get up there and, get your butt out of bed and get you moving and get you doing all these things. And then it gradually declines through the day, down, 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 so that you can be nice and low before you fall asleep at night. I mean, that's how it's supposed to work. And so again, the light that enters into the SCN, into the retina, into the eyes, is really, really, really critical. So people will say to me, well, I sleep with, in blackout curtains, or I sleep with a sleep mask. Or maybe people don't. They're like, well, I sleep with a lot of light around. Could that be affecting it? It's like, absolutely. Sleeping with or without light helps set your circadian rhythm. So I tell those people who wear sleep masks, who sleep in with the blackout curtains, I say, when you wake up in the morning, immediately, obviously take your mask off, but open the curtains, get some light exposure in, and that will help to address your cortisol awakening response. And so then I get asked a lot about this flip-flop, like, what does this flip-flop mean for the cortisol awakening response? And I remind people, when you open your eyes, you're conscious, but it takes about 20 to 30 minutes for you to go to consciousness, to full alertness, ready to go. And it's different parts of your brain where you flip from an area where you've been asleep to an area that's more sort of alert and ready to make executive decision. And so the big question always is, are you alert in the morning? And this is where having the cortisol awakening response can answer this question for people, and really just sort of dial into that first 30 to 60 minutes and say, are you alert? Can you go from consciousness to alertness? Can you get up in the morning? Are you so fatigued because your awakening response goes down? Are you anxious because you go up too much? And so by knowing the cortisol awakening response, that CAR, we can answer these questions.
Yeah. Do you think it's maybe one of those things where, because you don't feel 100% alert, you think that needs some sort of intervention, and so you take on some sort of intervention because but you don't realize that actually that's probably normal, and that's just the body warming up. And actually, if you didn't do anything, your alertness would go up. Either the coffee first thing in the morning is doing part of it, but actually it's just the fact that you just woke up.
Yeah, and honestly, the only way to know is to test, right? So let's say you wake up and you're just completely exhausted, and you think, well, I need to, have my coffee right away, or I need to have, whatever you do right away. Or you might think it's wrong. Just like you said, you might think it's a problem. You might tell your functional practitioner, when I wake up in the morning, I'm tired. It's like, you should be. You just opened your eyes. You're only conscious. It takes about 20 to 30 minutes for you to move into alertness. Now, it can take some people longer, and some people, they don't ever feel alert, unfortunately. They're the people that are like, I desperately need coffee. If I don't do any coffee at all in the morning, or any kind of caffeine, I'm never alert. Or maybe they do caffeine and they're still not alert. And by testing, by knowing their cortisol awakening response, they can really see this, and then they can address it, which we'll talk about in subsequent podcasts. But I want people to know, like, what really influences the cortisol awakening response, because it's not like something you're born with. It's not like set in stone, and once you've got your CAR, like, that's it. It's not like once it's low, or once it's high, it's high. And so your cortisol awakening response changes with age. It changes with things like anticipatory stress for the day, your sleep habits, obviously, people who have sleep apnea or disordered breathing, or they're mouth breathers at night, which is so common, that'll affect the way your CAR goes up or down in the morning. If you wake earlier than normal, so people who are waking up, 4 a.m. to catch a flight, obviously that day is going to be different. People with infections, overt or stealth, we're talking a lot about stealth infections, that can have a huge influence on the CAR in the morning. Autoimmune, which we'll talk about in a later podcast, the CAR and autoimmune are very tightly intertwined. And so it's one of my favorite things. If you can get the CAR dialed in, it can really help those with autoimmune. Psychological burnout, big one. We know that The workplace burnout is, a new ICD-10 that's coming out and is now being recognized by the WHO, but psychological burnout right there, chronic fatigue, PTSD, fluorescent lights. There was a study about fluorescent lights, people who sat under fluorescent lights for like 6 to 8 hours. It greatly suppressed their cortisol awakening response, which I would bet most people could just tell you that. You don't even need a study for that. People will say, I know when I go into stores with bright fluorescent lights, when I, sit at my office, I feel actually more tired after a while. It's like draining after a while. Any kind of traumatic brain injury that affects the hippocampus, which the car is directly set off, I should say, by the hippocampus, and then the hypothalamus and pituitary. A lot of people are on medications that are suppressive. So think your steroids, whether it's oral, inhaled, nasal sprays, topical steroids, or stimulatory, people who are on maybe ADD medications, or any kind of, they're taking cortisol to replace missing cortisol. Obviously that's going to have a big impact on the car. Caffeine, people who drink caffeine immediately upon waking, people who set the alarm on their coffee maker so it'll have coffee brewing when they wake up, or really lucky people who have their significant other bring them coffee in bed. That will affect the car. And then where a woman is in her cycle, at ovulation, her car is a lot higher. And so if she's testing and she's ovulatory, just know that it'll probably be quite a bit higher. And what's interesting is I ask women this, if they already have a hypervigilant car, do they feel more anxious around ovulation? And when women start tracking, it's amazing to see what they say, like, oh my gosh, around ovulation, I do have these feelings. I do get heart racing. I do feel, more stressed in the morning. I'm like, well, you're ovulating, everything's going up and the car goes up with it. Now, on the flip side, those are all the things that can influence a car. So what does the car influence? Well, like so many things. Energy levels, obviously, it goes up to get your butt out of bed and to put you into alertness. It affects your stress response and really your resilience. There's so much research out there on the car and resilience that it's a really good indicator of, are you resilient or are you not? Basically, are you stressed or are you stressed out? And that's why I really like running it.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because, one of the things that I'm focused on a little bit with some of the stuff that I've been doing with Jeff Bland and some of the stuff that we've been talking about is just literally thinking very differently about the numbers that we associate with our health, right? Because so many numbers in healthcare are actually all about disease risk. Right. And this seems to be a number that is starting the conversation towards, health, right? Mm-hmm. How resilient are you? And, do you feel like part of the reason maybe why this is becoming more of a thing is just because people are looking for markers that will determine, the bounce back ability of the body. And this seems to be something that is sort of moving in that direction.
100%. And what's really cool about the car is not only is it a marker of, like you were saying, resiliency instead of a disease risk, like what's actually happening real time in your body, but it is also a marker of disease risk. So for example, which will sort of cover in a later podcast, but research shows if you have breast cancer and a low CAR, your mortality risk goes up. So you have a disease risk just by looking at your car, right? But on the flip side, if you're stressed out and you have a low CAR, I know that your resiliency is low. Real time, I know real time your resiliency is low. So not only can I say real time, you're stressed out and it's showing all over your body because it's in the car, but also in the future, I can tell you that you have a higher risk of mortality if you develop breast cancer, but research is also in prostate cancer as well. So you can actually get both out of the cortisol awakening response, which is why I love it as a really cool marker. Other things the car influences, alertness, which I said, blood sugar management, obviously as cortisol goes up, it'll help you break down glucose because you've just been fasting all night. It affects your mood. It'll make you more anxious. It can induce panic. It actually can be a cause of depression and worry, hypervigilance, autoimmune development and progression, which we'll talk about, inflammation regulation. Of course, cortisol is anti-inflammatory to a point. And if you don't have that rise in the car, then you may be more inflamed than the average bear in the morning. And tons of people wake up and they're like, I wake up with migraines. I wake up with joint pain. I wake up, My shoulder hurts. I wake up and my stomach hurts. And it could have to do with the car's ability to regulate inflammation. Infection regulation, memory and recall, because the hippocampus is so tied into the car that if the car doesn't occur, then that memory and recall from the prior day can be affected. And how many people say to you, like, their memory is not what it used to be? They can't recall things like they used to, especially when they're stressed out. I have so many patients who say to me, my stress is a 10 out of 10, and I think I'm developing Alzheimer's because I can't remember anything. I'm like, yeah, the cortisol absolutely affects the hippocampus. You have to be careful. And then cancer outcomes, like I said, with health risk when it comes to a low CAR and increased risk for mortality in the future. So what the experts say is it's the mini stress test of your day, right? If you know your CAR, then you get all this insight in the ability of your HPA axis in the associated regions and structures. You know if your CAR is good, that you probably had decent sleep. Your hypothalamus is probably talking to your pituitary is probably talking down to your adrenal glands. You have decent stress resiliency if you have a normal CAR. And if you don't, then you know that a lot of those things have fallen off the tracks and you have to do something about it. So I tell people, if you can't get your CAR right, then how do you expect to get the rest of your stress response right? Because if you can't even do the most basic first thing in the morning thing, you're not going to get your blood sugar right. You're not going to get your autoimmune right? You're not going to get your inflammation right. You're not going to get your stress resiliency right. You're not going to get any of that right. You're not going to be able to fight infections correctly because you can't even get your cortisol awakening response right. So it's super important. It's super important as a biomarker. And so when people ask me, how does the CAR look different than like a traditional 4-point sort of adrenal test, I tell them it's actually 5 collections. It's more collections, more data points, because you do it first thing in the morning on waking, you do it 30 minutes later, you do it 30 minutes after that, and then around dinner and before bed. So you want that waking 30-30. So boom, 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 test right away, because we want to really hyper focus on that first hour for the CAR. We want to really make sure that you look right there, because if you let it go too long, if you do it in the morning, then at lunch, you missed it. You got to focus on that first 30 minutes. So with elevated CARs, examples of elevated CARs, people will say, Carrie, how do I know if it's high or not? Well, the only way to know is to test. But usually what will happen is that their 30-minute and maybe their 60-minute point will be really high, and they'll tell me, I feel anxious in the morning. I feel my heart racing in the morning. I can hear my heart rate, or my heartbeat in my ears in the morning. I get nervous in the morning. I feel like a chicken with my head cut off in the morning. I'm like, I would imagine you probably have an elevated CAR. On the opposite side, the low CAR people are the ones who tell me, I hit snooze 6 times. I need a lot of caffeine to get going. It takes a while to open my eyes. I don't feel human until about 10 a.m., maybe 11. And we have so many of these people, right? We have so many clients and patients that come in and say one of these 2 things all the time. And we know either way, their resiliency, their long-term health effects is probably not that good. Unfortunately, we want that CAR to be dialed in. So, those are all my key things when it comes to sort of the basics of the cortisol awakening response, and why I love it so much, because it's supposed to naturally occur in the morning within minutes of waking. It's supposed to push us into full alertness in about 20 to 30 minutes. And if it doesn't, then you're going to have problems with all sorts of systemic things: blood sugar, inflammation, infection, autoimmune. And it's influenced by so many things. So I know it's not set in stone, and I know that it's affecting other areas of my life, key areas like autoimmune, like cancer risk. So I want my CAR to be, pretty perfect.
How much, I know one of the things that we're sort of moving away from, if you look in a meta level, right, we're moving away from single measures to more, to more regular measures. Look at glucose monitoring versus continuous glucose monitoring. You get a lot more information when you have more time in there.
Yep.
So is that kind of, I would imagine that that's sort of one of the benefits here, is that you're getting more than one data point, and so you can start to make inferences about a physiological process, not just based on one number that could be high and could be low for a range of reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. Think about it. Think about traditional testing of saliva and adrenal glands. You do it in the morning and you do it at noon. And so if in the morning you're low, and at noon you're low, you don't know what happens in between there. You don't know if you shoot way up and then come down. You don't know if you stay low the entire time. So by going on waking 30 minutes later, 30 minutes after that, you get a really clear picture of, can you go up, down, or do you just stay low, or do you just keep going up? And just like you said, having all those data points, for some people can be challenging to collect, but I'm like, look, more data points means more health information I have to really be very personalized to what I'm going to do for your case. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, look, I'm super excited, for our community to bring this, we're going to focus on this for a few podcasts here, but for practitioners who are either not using this already or think that they'd like to be able to access this kind of information, what are some other ways that they can get up to speed with this kind of learning?
Well, definitely, I'm slightly biased, but I would look at www.dutchtest.com. Everything on there, all our webinars, information, videos are free. And we do have an upcoming Functional Endocrinology Summit, October 4th and 5th in Portland, Oregon. So check out dutchtest.com if you're interested in learning all things Dutch, but also just, again, cortisol awakening response, hormones, endocrinology on October 4th and 5th.
Amazing. All right. Well, Carrie, thanks so much for this podcast. We will do two more. So this month we were looking at, how CAR became this tool. In future sessions, we're going to talk about, what you learn from patients, and we're going to get deeper into that resilience conversation. And then we're also going to go deeper into, chronic health patients, because ultimately that's the majority of who's showing up in the practices of our community. So thanks so much for being part here and sharing such great information. And I hope you enjoyed it. Let us know what you thought in the comments, and we'll see you next month.